Our next speaker is Miriam Kivlehan from Ireland. She's a long-time activist in feminist and women's spaces and is going to give us an update on what's going on in Ireland.
Okay, so that's me, and I've just titled it Development, Debates and Dissent, sort of an activity update as to what's been happening in Ireland really for the last 2 years or so. Okay, so I thought maybe I would look first of all at kind of the legal and policy context, the drier stuff. So again, in terms of the Gender Recognition Act 2015, which is very often attributed to having been a precedent, even in terms of internationally and certainly in the English law, I suppose, domain, the Gender Recognition Act in Ireland was quite influential beyond the scope of the Irish jurisdiction and became borrowed. There has been no formal review of the gender self-ID model since that, so that still exists. It's still based on self-identification. It applies from 18 years, or 16 or 17-year-olds can self-ID with court order. Then in terms, sorry, the HSE then, after the Tavistock closed down, the HSE, which is the equivalent of your NHS system here, the HSE did have a referral pathway to the Tavistock. Since the Tavistock has closed down, there has been no pathway post that. So again, there has been a lot of inaction in many ways with regard to what's happening in Ireland in terms of those medical and what's called the trans healthcare. So there's still no alternative pathway created. There's a lot of lack of transparency with regard to the HSE. And I suppose that links in some ways to the CAS review. So how did Ireland respond to the CAS review? There was a lot of media silence on it initially, and a lot of political silence. I suppose they're the two main things. I mean, whilst the review had emphasised the lack of evidence for puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones in youth, and it recommended the holistic, cautious approach, there was sort of radio silence here for quite a while. I suppose people were hoping that there wouldn't be a response. Now, obviously, I suppose because there are the two jurisdictions, the north of Ireland and the south, and the north of Ireland is still very much linked, we'll say, to the British legal system. Very often there can be a conflict between what's happening in the north and what's happening in the south. So you don't necessarily have harmony across both jurisdictions. Having said that, there was eventually then some limited response to the CAS review. I think as an evidential document, it was very hard to ignore. So a lot of the activists were calling upon the likes of the HSE and calling on politicians to respond to it. So there was a little bit of media coverage, but I say not a lot. The HSE, tentatively, it appeared like that they might review their policy in light of CAS, but as yet, there is no indication of a policy review. And I suppose it was subject to the same, it did allow, I suppose, a talking point again for a lot of the activist organizations and groups to come back into the domain, because they usually don't have access to that kind of mainstream dialogue, be it political or media. So I suppose at least it was a fulcrum upon which some of the activist groups and the women's groups could try and raise the issue back into the public domain again. Political parties were equally inactive, I would say cowardly in many ways, because I think it's generally considered that a lot of the political parties probably don't have a consensus view with regard to this issue, and that they are aware of a lot of dissent within their own ranks. So therefore they just avoid the issue. They don't necessarily even address it openly within the political parties. So again, it's just, and last year, I suppose, when we had so many elections, we had local elections, European elections and national elections, all of the political parties would have been avoiding anything to do with this subject round about that time. So just still within that whole political and legal context, then we had more recently the UK Equality Act ruling. And just with regard to that in terms of Ireland, so again, there was interest here. There was quite a lot of interest in the ruling. And again, it's amazing the difference sometimes 6 months can have in terms of the willingness sometimes of even media to discuss it. But I think in many ways the reason why people found it easier to discuss that ruling was because there really isn't a comparative situation in Ireland. So and very often our pieces of legislation between Ireland and Britain are usually very, very well mirrored. But in the case of our equality legislation, we don't have a distinction at all between sex and gender. And gender is the default language exclusively that has been used in our legislation. So it's not really clear that there is an opportunity within our legislation to take the same type of challenge. It's more likely that what would be needed is a reform of our equality legislation, which is, of course, again, a much more difficult process because you will have the resistance. So we're be looking to amend that legislation, and there's no political will to go there. In the outgoing government, the last Minister O'Gorman, he did initiate a review of all the equality legislation, and that would have been about 2 years ago. So that would have been across the Equal Status Act and employment legislation. And I know there were huge amounts of responses and public submissions to that. I'd say far greater than he would have anticipated. So the result of that was, again, the review was shelved, and there was no action taken on it because a lot of the dissent emerged. And then last year we had all of these were intersecting, of course, in that whole space of the legal space. So we had hate crime and hate speech bills, which intersected with these issues. So we had initially a piece of legislation that was moving forward with criminalising hate as a crime, but also criminalising speech as a hate crime. So there were two different things. There was aggravated sentencing for all sorts of assault crimes, that there could be aggravated sentencing if it was motivated by hate. That gave rise to a lot of discourse. And then separate from that, there was a proposal to criminalise hate speech. What happened with that piece of legislation was they went forward with, even though it hasn't still been enacted yet, but they went forward with the hate crime part of it, but they dropped the hate speech part of it, because again, there were a lot of women's groups actually and women's activists that were very concerned about the hate speech, because again, in terms of the chilling effect that it has had on silencing discourse and how easy it is then just to label people transphobic, and the potential of criminalising discussions and public debate. So they were kind of the main overarching things in terms of the policy space. So then maybe just having a look at what has been happening, because I know some of these groups have contributed to your spaces before. So just looking at both the gender critical and radical feminist activism. So a number of groups had emerged over the last number of years. There was the Countess, the Women's Space Ireland, Radicalene, and then various alternative media have emerged. I know some have contributed to this space in the past. They have remained active. Now, I will say that in many ways there have been maybe some wedges have emerged in the last year or two over other issues. So there's not as much cohesion, and maybe there isn't even as much camaraderie between the different activist groups as there would have been in the past. Ireland is a very, very small population nationally, and even having different groups of itself, kind of reduces the impact or the scale. That said, most of the groups have taken particular roles, but they very much came together around about key campaigns. But in the last year, that hasn't been the case. We had a contentious referendum last year, two referendums, referenda, whichever, let the Latin scholars correct me on which is right or wrong. So one was a family amendment, and the other was a Kerr amendment, the shorthand. But one was to change the classification of, it was actually to remove the word mother out of the Irish Constitution. And that became a very, very interesting feminist debate in Ireland, because the assumption was before this that if you were progressive and feminist, you would definitely wouldn't want mothers protected in the Constitution. And that therefore removing it was a progressive idea, and that resistance to it would have been a conservative idea. But through a lot of debate and dialogue, it became quite apparent that there were a lot of progressive arguments for maintaining protections of mothers in the Constitution. So that fell. Now, unfortunately, the other one as well, which is the family amendment, which would have had a lot of benefits to women, also fell, because essentially what happened was there was really just one campaign. All of the political parties got behind the Yes, Yes campaign, and as also did the opposition parties. So in essence, you really didn't have an enlivened debate, and a lot of people would have voted against those amendments just out of a resistance to the fact that there wasn't really open discussion on both sides of it. So I mentioned that more in terms of the background, because there were other things happening that then began to drive, I suppose, a certain amount of wedges and wider space between the different groups. And that has certainly atomized and fragmented a lot of the action in many ways. Now, having said that, there was also opportunities even in terms of the election. So you would have had the likes of Leisha, who was involved in the contest. She went forward for election. She stood, she sought election to the upper house, the Seanad. So again, finding women who did go and decide to run for election, it gave them a certain platform to discuss those issues, even where they were unsuccessful. But those are still the most, and then we've had a lot of the alternative media, and I know that was mentioned earlier. So there are a lot of other spaces now emerging, be it through podcasts and Substacks, and you've had the likes of Stella O'Malley and the Jen Specht and her podcasts. So there's, whilst there aren't hostilities, I will say that it's not that there are hostilities within the groups, there just isn't the same amount of cohesion because of various other things that might have driven space there. On the other side of it then, in terms of the LGBTQ plus lobbying, you've had, I suppose, the strengthening in many ways of the likes of TENI, the Transgender Equality Network Ireland, and Belong To, which is more the youth faction of that. Well, it's broader than that. Belong To is quite LGBTQ as well. They're very well positioned. They certainly have very close links with state departments. They continue to be extremely well funded. They have a lot of influence on policy, both at, as NGOs, both in terms of literature and in terms of political policy, and they're quite strong lobby groups. So in terms of education, they have certainly fairly successfully inserted themselves into schools and into new curriculum development. So again, there was quite a lot of discourse last year around a subject that is in the schools called SPHE, Social, Personal and Health Education. And there were new curriculum materials being developed around that. And a lot of them, once those materials were coming into the public domain, there was a lot of discourse around what was very obviously gender ideology, and also some very problematic attitudes towards things like race and ethnicity. One could argue that some of them were nearly sort of like the Robin DiAngelo critical race theory ideas being applied. So that again became a whole other discussion. But again, I think what it did was it made a lot of people aware of the proximity that these lobby groups have to the formation of things like educational materials that find their way into the schools and into onto the curriculum. So yeah, that's so public flashpoints. I suppose we've had this, like in most places, sports, prisons and shelters. So in terms of the indigenous sports in Ireland, you have the Gaelic Athletic Association. That's a male sport. They look after exclusively the Irish men's football, Gaelic football and hurling. And then you have the LGFA, which is the Ladies Gaelic Football Association, an entirely separate self-governed organisation. And they formed their version of the game back in the 70s. And then you've rugby and swimming. Now, the LGFA, there was certainly a lot of talk last year because there was a certain amount of policy capture and there were decisions. So this would be an all-female organisation, and therefore at its national council level and its higher executives would be female. They did take a decision to allow trans women to participate in LGFA events. So that certainly was a flashpoint. There were a lot of rank and file LGFA members, lower women who were playing in the game, who did stick their head above the parapet. And so there was a feeling that there was policy decisions being made by at senior executive level that didn't actually have the support and mandate of the players at club level and provincial level. So rugby, conversely then, the women's rugby has adopted the international position on it. So they are very clear that they don't recognise the transgender self-identification in terms of participation in women's rugby. And we've had, again, flashpoints around the prisons, the male-born individuals in female wings. That's still it goes largely unreported. We had a few high-profile cases like the Barbie Kardashian that would occasionally make its way into maybe tabloid newspapers, but the lesser-known cases not so much. So again, there are sort of small groups of women who act as watchdogs around that particular space, and they bring that to the fore where they can. And then a little bit as well around about the domestic violence shelters and rape crisis centres. I think they are particularly silent in many ways with regard to it. They don't want to take any kind of public positions on it. Most of the rape crisis and domestic violence shelters are all very small, locally based services. They're all non-profits. They're independently constituted. They're significantly reliant on both public funding and on donations. And I suppose very often they just kind of keep a division between getting engaged in the public debate and trying to protect the work that they're doing with women. So that hasn't become a particularly nationally discussed issue. Well, certainly not from within the stakeholders. Media discourse, I suppose, if you're to look at it, it falls into the two categories. You have the mainstream media and you have the independent and alternative medias. So, I mean, just to sort of be very generalized about it, the mainstream media still very much takes this affirmation-led approach to the whole discussion. And on the other hand, then you have to look to alternative media, podcasts, and as I said, the blogs and Substacks to find independent voices that are challenged. That the only exception to the likes of the mainstream media is there's one conservative, quite right-wing media that is now an accredited mainstream media, I suppose, if you like, body, gripped media. So again, and again, it's a lot of male voices that actually are speaking within those media forums. So what you often have is in the mainstream media, those that are speaking about the trans issue, and they're never speaking about trans men, they're only talking about trans women, are men. So men are very often dominating the conversation in the mainstream media, and it's not women, it's not women-led. So yeah, so that's sort of where where we are with media. This is just, so then to continue on that theme then, how very often men can actually take up quite a lot of the space. So there's been, some of you may have come across this Enoch Burke saga, I shall call it. So it's one individual who has, there's a lot of sensationalized media around this particular case. It gets a lot of spotlight. There's no substance usually to it. It's one guy who was fired from his job as a teacher because he refused to endorse the pronouns. Now, he was working in a well, most of the schools in Ireland follow one or other of the main church ethoses, either Roman Catholic or Protestant. This was in a Protestant school, but the school had adopted a policy that the students could choose their own pronouns. He refused to endorse that. He was sanctioned, he was suspended from his job, and he basically took up a strike action outside of the school. They still haven't gone through a disciplinary process, so he's still on the payroll, and this is about 2 years on. But because he was in occupation outside the school gates, they took him to court to have him charged with trespass, and he was charged with trespass, and he just kept breaching it. So he's ended up going to prison on quite a few occasions on trespass and contempt of court because he wouldn't purge his contempt. But to the outside world, that has become that he's going to jail because of his views on transgenderism. So it has conflated and taken up a lot of the space. And it's absolutely, sometimes it's framed as a gender row, but it's actually just as a contempt of court and employment issues. They're an extremely evangelical family, and they've been involved in lots of issues over the years. So his particular position is rooted in religious ideology, and because it's unrepresentative of any kind of feminist critique, it has forced a lot of the groups and the women to constantly disavow themselves from the Enoch Burke saga. So it was worthy of putting it up there because, as I say, it gets implicated in so many things. So just in terms of, I suppose, maybe trying to kind of round it off and see where we are now. Ireland has been slow to adapt, as I suppose, despite the more external global shift, and that we have seen, and that we would be aware of in the English-speaking world. The legal and the medical ambiguity still persists. Women's voices are rising, but the activism is extremely fragmented. As I say, so many other issues that have come to the fore that have driven political wedges between women. And sometimes it's not even just around stuff like that necessarily just impacts women, but I suppose there is a bit of a left-right divide as well, and even within some of those circles. So sometimes it can be the geopolitics in Ireland. It can be something like support of the Palestinian cause and not support of the Palestinian cause. It has literally split women who would have been had a certain amount of cohesion around about the transgender stuff. So and then there have been a lot of pipelines have emerged in terms of all of the other tensions with regard to immigration, has created so many pipelines that people have now moved towards, and women as well have moved into those. So it's really hard to see where women are moving towards, but there's been quite a lot have moved to the right in terms of conservatism, but some have gone to the far right and down some of these kind of neo-nationalist into these neo-nationalist warrens as well. And meanwhile, I suppose we have so much political cowardice that definitely political courage is certainly needed in terms of moving forward.